Why the Viet Cong dreaded the Australian diggers' night raids. In the pitch-black night, the jungle was alive with danger. Silent, unseen figures moved through the underbrush like ghosts, their every step calculated and controlled. The Viet Cong had no idea they were there, until it was too late. They had feared the Australian diggers for a reason. These soldiers, known for their brutal night raids, were a force unlike any other. The diggers had a deadly reputation, built on their ability to infiltrate, strike hard, and vanish without a trace. The darkness was their ally, and the Viet Cong were about to learn just how deep their fear ran. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Chapter 1. The Night Falls. The Strategy of Surprise. The dense jungle swallowed the last rays of the setting sun, plunging the world into darkness. The air was thick with moisture, and the constant hum of insects filled the silence. The Australian diggers, however, were not bothered by the oppressive heat or the weight of their gear. For them, the night was an ally, a time to strike fear into the hearts of the Viet Cong. Imagine being one of these soldiers, a member of the 1st Australian Task Force, as you prepare for yet another night raid deep in enemy territory. The jungle around you feels suffocating, each branch and vine pressing in on you. But inside, there is no panic. There is only the hum of controlled energy, the quiet determination of men who have trained for this very moment. You know that the key to survival and victory is to remain as silent as the shadows. The plan was simple but effective. Small, highly trained patrols moving in total silence. The diggers would make their way through the jungle, taking advantage of the thick cover to get close to their targets without being detected. Noise discipline was paramount. The slightest sound could give away their position. A broken twig, a misstep on a muddy patch. Anything could betray them. Every soldier was trained to move silently with a single goal in mind. Strike swiftly, strike hard, and disappear before the enemy even knew what had happened. The night was filled with the sound of boots slapping against the wet earth, the quiet rustle of leaves as soldiers carefully made their way forward. They moved in tight, staggered formations, with each soldier covering the other. Their weapons were held ready, and their eyes were always scanning, always alert. A missed movement or a lapse in focus could mean death. Every soldier knew that. The Australian approach to warfare was methodical. In Vietnam, the diggers understood that speed and surprise were the keys to success. The enemy knew the terrain well, but the Australians had learned to use it to their advantage. They knew how to blend into the jungle, how to track their targets, and, most importantly, how to make sure the Viet Cong didn't know they were there, until it was too late. As the patrols advanced, the soldiers relied heavily on their training and their comrades. The mental preparation was as intense as the physical. In a place like this, there was no room for hesitation or fear. A moment's doubt could cause an entire mission to fail. The diggers were calm under fire, their minds sharpened by countless hours of practice, their bodies conditioned by the brutal demands of jungle warfare. They knew their equipment, every rifle, every grenade, every radio, and more importantly, they knew their teammates. Trust was their foundation. Their method of movement was precise. At times, they would crawl along the jungle floor, low to the ground, to avoid being silhouetted by the occasional glimmer of moonlight. In other moments, they would move in near total darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of their night vision equipment. The jungle was a maze of shadows and sounds, but to the diggers, it was home. They had learned to adapt to its unforgiving nature, the sweltering heat, the thick underbrush, the biting insects. It was all part of the challenge. It was all part of the fight. The soldiers' packs were heavy, each one loaded with ammunition, rations, and communication gear. Every item had a purpose, and each man carried his share with quiet determination. The weight of the load was nothing compared to the burden of responsibility. Every soldier in the patrol knew that their actions that night would affect their comrades' lives. One mistake, one careless moment, and everything could unravel. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the noise of the night seemed to close in on them. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of unseen creatures, the distant hum of helicopters. All of it seemed to merge into a single, overpowering sensation. Yet the diggers remained focused, their training kicking in. Every sound was analyzed, every movement calculated. They were aware of the potential dangers, the traps the Viet Cong might have set, but they were ready for anything. Imagine the tension in the air as the patrol neared the Viet Cong camp. Each soldier was hyper-aware, every sense heightened. They knew that one misstep could lead to disaster, but still, they moved forward. The fear of failure was a constant companion, but it was a fear that pushed them to excel. It kept them sharp. It kept them alive. The jungle was no place for hesitation. The diggers knew that the success of the raid depended not just on their tactical skills, but on their mental strength. They would have to fight not only the enemy, but the jungle itself. Every step, every breath was a test of endurance, and with each step, they drew closer to their target. With the night fully enveloping them, the Australian soldiers had become one with the darkness. Their movements were so fluid, so synchronized, that they seemed to be part of the jungle itself. The world around them had become a blur, and all that mattered was the mission. They had become predators, moving with purpose, knowing that soon they would strike. In the stillness of the night, the diggers knew that fear was their enemy. It had no place in the jungle, where survival depended on discipline, trust, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. The raid would soon begin, and for the Viet Cong it would be a night they would never forget. Chapter 2. Into the heart of the jungle, Viet Cong territory. The jungle had a life of its own. It was a maze of thick trees, sharp vines, and dense foliage. But to the Australian diggers, it was a battlefield, a place where silence was deadly, and every movement counted. As they moved deeper into the heart of Viet Cong territory, the atmosphere grew heavier, the stakes higher. They had to be careful, methodical. The enemy was everywhere, hiding in the shadows, just like them. Imagine being a part of this patrol, creeping through the jungle. Each step calculated. The soldiers around you know the risks. They know that the Viet Cong are watching, waiting, ready to spring an ambush at any moment. But even in the midst of this threat, the soldiers' focus is unwavering. They move together in complete silence, eyes scanning the trees, listening for any signs of movement, an unintended noise, a crackling branch, a whispered voice. The thick undergrowth was a challenge, its tangled roots and thick vines making every step feel like a small battle. But the diggers knew this terrain like no one else. The jungle, with its challenges, was as much their ally as it was the enemy's. Every tree, every patch of earth, had a purpose. They were experts at moving through the dense foliage, using their surroundings to their advantage. The Viet Cong, though knowledgeable in their own right, had the disadvantage of facing an enemy who had mastered the terrain. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Every soldier was alert, his senses heightened. The jungle was alive with sounds, animals scurrying, birds calling. But the diggers had learned to tune it all out. Their focus was razor sharp. They could feel the sweat beading on their faces, their clothes sticking to their bodies in the oppressive humidity. But there was no time to dwell on discomfort. Every second in the jungle was one more chance for the enemy to strike. The terrain itself posed its own dangers. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, making every breath feel like an effort. The soldiers carried heavy loads, rifles, grenades, ammunition, radios, each one an added burden. The humidity clung to their skin, their clothes drenched in sweat. The thick vegetation made the slightest movement feel like a major event. Every rustling leaf was a potential threat. Every footstep was a risk. But there was more than just the physical strain. The mental toll was just as demanding. The diggers knew they were operating in enemy territory, and they knew that danger could come from any direction. The fear of an ambush was ever present, a constant shadow. They had learned to keep their emotions in check, to push aside the fear and focus on the mission. The only thing that mattered now was getting to the target, hitting it hard, and getting out without the Viet Cong even knowing what hit them. Each soldier was part of a tight-knit team. The trust they had in each other was unspoken but absolute. They moved in small, staggered formations, with each man watching the soldier in front, while also keeping an eye on the surroundings. This trust was their foundation. In the jungle, there was no room for error. The soldiers knew that if they missed a detail, if they weren't paying attention, it could mean their lives. They depended on each other in a way that only soldiers in the most dangerous of situations could. As the patrol moved deeper into the jungle, the silence between them became even more pronounced. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. They passed through areas where the vegetation grew even denser, and the path forward seemed to disappear into the dark shadows of the trees. Every so often, they would pause, crouching low, scanning the horizon for signs of movement. The faintest sound, a branch snapping, a footstep in the distance, was enough to put them on edge. The Viet Cong knew these forests well. They had set up hidden bases and supply routes deep in the jungle, relying on the dense foliage to keep their movements secret. But the Australians had learned how to navigate the same terrain. They had the advantage of training and experience. They knew that moving in the jungle required more than just skill. It required patience. The diggers knew that the enemy would not attack unless they had no other option, so they had to remain invisible, patient, until the right moment arrived. The soldiers were well aware of the dangers that lay ahead. The Viet Cong could be anywhere, hidden in the trees, lying in wait, or setting traps in the underbrush. They had learned how to strike quickly, disappearing into the jungle just as fast as they came. The diggers had their own methods, though, strategies honed over countless raids and ambushes. They moved deliberately, scanning for signs of the enemy while keeping their own movements as silent as possible. As they neared their target area, the tension increased. The soldiers knew that they were nearing a Viet Cong stronghold, a place where the enemy was likely prepared to fight back. Every soldier was on edge, ready to react at a moment's notice. The mental pressure was intense. The fear of what could be waiting for them in the darkness was ever present, but they trusted their training. They trusted each other, and most importantly, they trusted the silent, deadly movement that had gotten them this far. Imagine the moment when they finally reached the target area. The air seems to still, the jungle holding its breath. The soldiers crouch low, their hearts pounding in their chests. They are close now. The diggers know the raid will begin soon. But for now, it's about patience. It's about waiting for the right moment, the right signal, when everything will explode into action. This was the heart of the jungle. This was where the enemy was most dangerous. But the Australian diggers had faced it all before. They knew the enemy's methods. They knew the terrain. And as they waited, their minds remained sharp, their bodies ready for whatever came next. Chapter 3. Engaging the enemy. The raid unfolds. The silence that had enveloped the jungle now felt like an electric charge, the calm before the storm. Every soldier knew what was coming. The raid. They had trained for this moment countless times, but now that it was finally here, the tension was palpable. The operation was simple in its strategy, but demanding in its execution. The diggers were not just there to fight. They were there to strike swiftly, decisively, and disappear, before the enemy even knew they had arrived. Imagine standing at the edge of a Viet Cong base, your rifle in hand, sweat dripping down your face as you silently wait for the signal. Every muscle in your body is tense, your breathing controlled. You can hear the sounds of the jungle, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, the occasional buzz of insects. But your focus is absolute. You know the raid will be fast, violent, and deadly. The clock is ticking, and every second matters. At the signal, everything explodes into action. The patrol moves in a flash of speed and precision, each soldier taking their assigned position with military efficiency. They had practiced this raid in the harshest conditions, and now the training kicked in. The sound of boots moving through the jungle was replaced by the rapid-fire bursts of rifles and the crack of grenades. The quiet, controlled movements of the patrol were now replaced by the chaos of combat. The diggers had learned to strike fast and hard. They would hit the enemy's position with overwhelming force, using their firepower to surprise and incapacitate them before they could mount a proper defense. Every soldier knew their role. Some laid down suppressing fire to keep the Viet Cong pinned, while others moved in closer, pushing forward to clear the area. The patrol worked as one, a synchronized machine. Every move made with deadly intent. In the heat of the raid, time seemed to stretch. What was planned to be a quick, surgical strike became a battle of endurance. The soldiers advanced in tight formations, their rifles raised, eyes scanning the dark shadows for any movement. The Viet Cong were caught off guard, their reaction time too slow. Some tried to flee, others attempted to fight back, but the diggers were already on them. The assault was swift, precise. In those first few minutes, the outcome was already clear. The Australians would dominate. At the raid, it was not without its challenges. The soldiers had to fight through thick vegetation, often finding themselves in close quarters combat. The heavy jungle canopy made it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction, forcing the soldiers to rely on instinct and their training. Even though they had the element of surprise, the conditions remained hostile. The ground was soft and slippery, the mud making each step feel like a battle in itself. The soldiers had to keep their wits about them, moving quickly but cautiously, making sure not to let their guard down. The air was thick with smoke from the grenades, and the stench of sweat and gunpowder hung heavy in the air. The sound of rifles firing filled the jungle, a rapid staccato rhythm in the stillness of the night. But amid the chaos, the diggers remained calm. They had trained for moments like this, where the world seemed to collapse into confusion. Despite the violence of the raid, their minds were sharp, focused on the mission at hand. There was no time for fear or hesitation. The enemy was right in front of them, and they had to finish the job. For some of the soldiers, the noise of combat was overwhelming. The roar of gunfire, the explosions, the cries of comrades and enemies alike, everything seemed to happen all at once. But the diggers had learned to tune it out. Their training had instilled in them the ability to focus, to shut out everything but mission. In those moments of intense combat, their bond with each other grew stronger. They were not just soldiers. They were brothers in arms. They relied on one another to survive. Despite their success in the initial stages of the raid, the diggers knew they couldn't let their guard down. The Viet Cong, while initially surprised, would regroup and try to fight back. The raid was far from over. The Australians had to move fast, clear their objectives, and withdraw before the enemy could organize a counterattack. They couldn't afford to linger. The jungle, as familiar as it was to them, could quickly become a trap if they didn't stay vigilant. The soldiers were aware that each decision they made could be the difference between life and death. Should they advance? Should they secure the area? Should they fall back? The constant mental calculation was exhausting. There was no room for mistakes. Every soldier knew that their survival, and the success of the mission, depended on their ability to remain sharp, calm, and focused. They moved as one, responding to the unspoken cues that flowed between them. As the firefight raged on, the soldiers used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They took cover behind trees, rocks, and the jungle's natural barricades, always moving to positions that offered the best angles of attack. The Viet Cong, meanwhile, tried to retreat into the deeper parts of the jungle, hoping to escape the diggers' rapid advance. But the Australians were not about to let them slip away. The raid had to be decisive. At one point, a soldier in the front of the patrol moved forward to clear a small structure, a hut that the Viet Cong had been using as a makeshift bunker. As he approached, a burst of gunfire erupted from within, and the soldier instinctively dropped to the ground. But the reaction was immediate. A teammate fired a well-placed shot, disabling the threat. It was a stark reminder of how quickly things could go from calm to chaotic in the blink of an eye. As the raid continued, the adrenaline from the initial assault began to fade, replaced by a cold, focused determination. The diggers knew they were nearing the end of their mission. The target had been hit, the objectives met. The Viet Cong had been caught off guard, and the raid was proving to be a success. But the soldiers were not done yet. They needed to secure the area, gather intelligence, and then retreat, quickly and without leaving a trace. The raid was a success, but the cost of that success would not be fully understood until the aftermath. For now, the soldiers moved through the aftermath of the raid with precision, their eyes scanning for any lingering threats. The mission wasn't over until they had safely extracted themselves from the enemy's territory. Chapter 4. The Withdrawal. Victory. But at what cost? The raid was over, but the danger was far from gone. In the aftermath of the lightning-fast strike, the jungle was quiet again, almost eerily so. The crackling of leaves and the hiss of the humid air were the only sounds left in the thick darkness. The Viet Cong, caught off guard and overwhelmed, had been scattered, but they were still out there, hiding in the shadows, possibly planning a counterattack. The soldiers of the 1st Australian Task Force knew that their mission wasn't complete until they had made it out safely back to their base. Imagine the exhaustion you feel as the dust settles after the chaos of battle. Your body is covered in dirt and sweat, your muscles aching from the intense exertion. Your rifle feels heavier now, your backpack like a lead weight. But you don't stop. The adrenaline from the raid has faded, leaving you with a sense of calm, but also fatigue. The sounds of battle still echo in your mind, and the realization that you've survived the night, only to face the danger of retreat, settles in. The worst part wasn't the attack. It was what came after. As the soldiers begin their withdrawal, they move with the same discipline that had guided them during the raid. But now the mission had a new urgency. They had struck quickly and effectively, but now they had to leave. The enemy was likely regrouping, and the jungle offered them no refuge if they lingered too long. Every soldier was on edge, alert for any signs of pursuit. The jungle, once their ally, now seemed like an overwhelming, suffocating labyrinth. Every tree, every shadow could hide a threat. The soldiers took the same careful, silent approach to their withdrawal as they had to their advance. Every step had to be deliberate. There was no room for mistakes. The diggers, known for their precision and training, moved swiftly and quietly, knowing that one misstep could bring disaster. They kept their formations tight, moving in pairs or small groups, covering each other as they navigated the difficult terrain. The thick mud and tangled roots were a challenge even in daylight, but at night they were an obstacle that could easily lead to a soldier being separated from the group. Losing one man in the jungle could mean the difference between life and death. The physical toll was evident. Carrying their weapons and ammunition, the soldiers trudged through the thick jungle undergrowth, their uniforms caked in mud, their boots heavy with the wet soil of the jungle floor. The heat and humidity were unbearable, but the mental exhaustion was even worse. The soldiers had been operating under high stress for hours, and their bodies had been pushed to the limit, but there was no time to rest. They had to keep moving, faster now, more focused than ever. The jungle seemed to close in on them, the shadows pressing down, as they made their way back to the extraction point. As they moved, the toll of combat began to take shape. Some soldiers had cuts and bruises from navigating the dense jungle. Others had scratches and insect bites from pushing through the undergrowth. Their clothes were torn, their weapons coated in the residue of battle. The physical exhaustion was matched only by the psychological weight of the night's events. The fear and adrenaline of the raid still lingered, but now the soldiers were dealing with the emotional aftermath. The chaos of the attack had given way to the grim reality of survival. The soldiers relied on one another, leaning on the bonds they had forged during the raid. They had been through the worst together, and now they had to trust each other to make it through the final stretch. The jungle was still full of danger, Viet Cong ambushes, traps, or even wild animals, but they were no longer the same men who had entered the jungle hours ago. Their camaraderie, forged in the heat of battle, was their greatest weapon now. The fear of being pursued was ever present. The soldiers knew that the Viet Cong wouldn't just let them leave without a fight. They had to be on constant alert, scanning the jungle for any sign of movement. Every sound, a rustling leaf, a snap of a branch, had the potential to be an enemy. The soldiers moved quickly but cautiously, knowing that even a small mistake could lead to disaster. The jungle was vast and treacherous, but they had learned to use it to their advantage. Still, the unease of being hunted was difficult to shake. Every now and then, the soldiers would pause, crouching low to the ground, their hearts pounding in their chests. They listened carefully, their senses heightened. The sound of the jungle seemed louder in these moments, and the smallest noise could mean an ambush was imminent. But each time, they pressed forward, inching closer to their extraction point. The clock was ticking. They had to get out before the Viet Cong regrouped. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silent movement, the soldiers reached the extraction point. The helicopter would be coming in soon, but it wasn't just a moment of relief. It was a moment of reflection. They had made it out. They had survived the raid. But at what cost? The physical toll was clear, but the emotional impact of the night would linger long after the mission was over. As the helicopter touched down, the soldiers filed onto the aircraft, their bodies worn and battered, but their spirits unbroken. They had completed the mission, but the raid had taken its toll. For some, it was a sense of victory, a job well done. For others, it was a moment of quiet, reflection, on the friends they had fought with, on the comrades they had lost, and on the harsh reality of war. The ride back to base was a quiet one. The soldiers sat in silence, their faces weary but determined. The raid had been a success, but they knew that the war was far from over. There would be more battles, more raids, more nights like this. But for now, they had made it through, and that was enough. Chapter 5. The Legacy. Why the Viet Cong dreaded the diggers. The Viet Cong had learned to fear the Australian diggers, not just because of their tactics, but because of the psychological toll they inflicted. It wasn't just the speed of the raids, the shock of being attacked under the cover of night, or the overwhelming force with which the Australians struck. It was the terror of never knowing when or where the diggers would strike next. The Viet Cong understood this well. The Australians' ability to operate in the jungle, their patience, and their relentless pursuit of their objectives had turned them into a force that haunted the Viet Cong's every move. Imagine being a Viet Cong soldier deep in the jungle, your eyes scanning the dense underbrush, constantly wondering if tonight would be the night the Australians would come for you. The fear was palpable. They could hear the stories. The diggers' night raids had earned them a reputation as ghosts, striking fast and without warning. The toll it took on the enemy's morale was immeasurable. The Viet Cong weren't just facing a well-trained military force. They were facing an enemy that knew how to use the very jungle they hid in as a weapon. The diggers were everywhere, and nowhere at once. For the Australians, this fear they instilled was not just an accident. It was a byproduct of their tactical superiority and psychological warfare. The Australians had learned from previous campaigns and their own experiences. Night raids were more than just a way to disrupt the enemy's operations. They were a way to break the spirit of the Viet Cong. Each raid, each attack under the cover of darkness, sent a clear message. The enemy would never know when or where the next strike would come. They would never have the luxury of feeling safe, even in their own hideouts. This was something the Viet Cong had not been prepared for. They had seen the Australians in combat during the day, but nothing had prepared them for the sheer unpredictability of the diggers at night. It wasn't just the element of surprise that caught the enemy off guard. It was the Australians' mastery of stealth, their ability to vanish into the jungle like shadows, leaving no trace of their presence. The Viet Cong, who were used to fighting under the cover of night, found themselves at a disadvantage against the diggers, who embraced the darkness and turned it into a weapon of their own. For the soldiers of the 1st Australian Task Force, the night raids were a way of life. They had honed their skills over months and years of training. The soldiers had learned to navigate the jungle with ease, to understand its moods, to use its shadows to their advantage. They were silent as ghosts, moving in tight-knit teams that struck swiftly and then disappeared just as quickly. The raids themselves were brutal but efficient, often over before the Viet Cong had time to react. The key to success was speed and precision, attacking with overwhelming force, hitting hard and fast, and then fading back into the jungle as quickly as they had come. But it wasn't just the diggers' physical tactics that the Viet Cong feared. It was the psychological impact of these raids, the fear of the unknown. For the Viet Cong, every night became a waiting game. Would the Australians strike tonight? Would they hit their position? Would they wipe out their base? This constant anxiety, the fear that the diggers could be anywhere and everywhere, took its toll on the morale of the Viet Cong. It left them questioning their safety, eroding their sense of confidence in their own operations. The Australians' ability to maintain this level of psychological pressure on the enemy was one of the key factors in their success. The fear the Viet Cong felt was not just a reaction to combat. It was the result of being hunted, always being on edge, never knowing when the next raid would come. It was a mental game, as much as it was a physical one. And in this game, the Australians were masters. But the fear was not one-sided. For the diggers, these raids were just as much a psychological challenge as they were a physical one. The soldiers knew that their survival depended on their ability to stay calm under pressure, to maintain control over their minds in the face of danger. The mental and physical exhaustion after a successful raid was immense. The toll of constant vigilance, of operating under the stress of being deep in enemy territory, weighed heavily on them. But they had learned to deal with it. They had learned to push through the fear, the exhaustion, and the uncertainty, knowing that their comrades were depending on them. The psychological toll on the Australians was just as real as the toll on the Viet Cong. The soldiers carried the memories of these raids with them, the moments of fear, the quick decisions made in the heat of battle, and the faces of the comrades they had lost. But they also carried the knowledge that they had struck fear into the enemy's heart, that their reputation alone had a lasting impact. For the diggers, this was part of their legacy, their ability to instill fear, not through sheer force, but through the relentless, calculated pressure they put on their enemies. As the war dragged on, the reputation of the Australian diggers' night raids continued to grow. The Viet Cong, once confident in their ability to operate in the jungle, now found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, always wondering if tonight would be the night the Australians would strike. The psychological toll of these raids was not something the Viet Cong could easily recover from. It wore them down, bit by bit, until they were no longer the formidable force they once were. In the end, the Australian diggers had done more than just execute successful night raids. They had broken the will of the Viet Cong. They had made their enemies fear them in a way that was not only physical, but mental. It was a legacy that would live on long after the war had ended. The story of the diggers, the soldiers who struck fear into the hearts of their enemies, and the night raids that became the stuff of legend.